This week on London Real, we have Todd Pierce, former U.S. Army Judge Advocate General and defender of 3 clients at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba.
How can you have a democracy and make wise decisions by the people who are supposed to be making the decisions, the electorate, if you don't have the right to know, if they don't have access to the information they need?
But Guantanamo was probably the best option because it was not on U.S. territory.
Well, the best option if you wanted to violate the law. Indefinite detention itself can rise to the level of torture. They're trying to discourage detainees from meeting with their attorneys. It just was ominous almost when Bush said, if you're not with us, you're against us. That is the way of thinking of authoritarianism. This appears a lot like martial law being exercised globally, and in fact it is. This is what we need to realize is you put somebody in charge and with no oversight and people die. And they may well be our own soldiers.
London Real presents Todd Pierce, Guantanamo Bay.
The Department of Justice, unashamedly argued that, of course, the president has authority to kill U.S. citizens.
Welcome back to London Real. I am here at Liverpool Street Station, which is my old stomping ground in the city of London, where all of these beautiful buildings and nice sports cars and suits that you see people wearing are brought to you by you, the folks at home, for putting your money into savings accounts and building societies and allowing the interest on that to pay and help feed a banker. So we just want to say thank you for that. Keep those deposits coming. My guest today is a very unique gentleman, and it's an episode that I've actually had in the can for a couple months now, and I'm very happy to release it now. His name is Mr. Todd E. Pierce, and Todd is a former major in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General. What is that, you say? That's a great question. What his role was to defend 3 clients, and I call them clients, that were located at the Guantanamo Bay Detention Camp in Cuba. A piece of real estate that the U.S. still leases from Cuba, even though I'm fairly sure the Castro doesn't cash the rent checks because they actually don't believe that we should be there. But that's a whole nother story. Part of Todd's job was to defend people that have never been given a trial by the U.S. government. And it's a topic that I thought we should talk about. It's one that kind of bothers me as an American. I was in New York City for the 9/11 tragedy. I had a couple friends that were up in the very top floors of the World Trade Center, and it pissed me off to no end, to be very honest with you. I smelled the decomposing flesh and what I thought was jet fuel from the remains, because I lived in the East Village very close. And I wasn't happy about what happened, but I'm also not happy that people can be held by the United States government and not be given a fair trial. It seems one of the most un-American things I can imagine. And so I think it's a topic that we need to talk about. I'm not saying these people didn't do bad things, but for 12 years to be held without a trial, I think that's wrong. So Todd is here to talk about that. He's also a fascinating guy because he goes back to the Civil War and looks at some of the pieces of law used in the Civil War to combat what he calls terrorists that could be even on our own soil in America. And he's got a very interesting perspective also on the Espionage Act of 1917, which is something that the Bush and the Obama administration cite to this day when it comes to NSA and other pieces of legislation. And it's something that a lot of people think is really quite outdated with the way that they can enforce it on citizens. He's also got some opinions, as do I, whether the U.S. should be legally allowed to kill U.S. citizens located outside the country. And so this episode really comprises a lot of pieces here. It's not just about those detainees in Guantanamo Bay. It's about the freedom of information, and it's about authoritarian rule. And as Todd says, it being a former member of the military himself, whether we should allow these generals to make these decisions. And he cites things that happened in Vietnam and a lot of other past eras where, these high-ranking military officials were allowed to make decisions that are basically foreign and domestic policy. So it's a discussion that we really need to have. I want to thank Annie Michon, the former whistleblower for MI5, for introducing me to Todd, and also to Jesselyn Raddick and Thomas Drake, who were also on the show. Another highly watched episode about Jesselyn. She's the attorney for Edward Snowden, and Thomas Drake was kind of the pre-Snowden who did everything by the book when it came to whistleblowing in the NSA, and he got busted for it up and down the street. And he was actually an inspiration into the method that Edward used to reveal his information, as in do it once you've left the country, and a lot of other nuances that you would think are obvious, but really weren't quite obvious when it comes from someone who used to work for those services. So hope you enjoy this episode. I think it's important to address these topics. They seem normal to me, but I think a lot of the mainstream media does shy away from these when it just seems so obvious that we need to talk about them. So please give me your comments, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, and let me know what you think. And as we stroll through the city of London here, just want to make sure you've checked out our brand new website. It's fantastic. I'm really happy with it. Finally, you can search our episodes by topic. So if you want to find out all the episodes we've done on psychedelics, or all the episodes we've done on MMA, or all the episodes we've done on activists, you can do that now by going to our episodes page and click on those funny icons. They got all sorts of like little mushrooms or little MMA gloves. And it's a great way to really get to know our content. We got a fresh look for the website, and I'm really happy. So I just wanted to thank the guys that have always supported us at Squarespace. They're an all-in-one platform that makes it super easy to make your own website. And, I just drag and drop the content. As you can see, it looks beautiful. So if you want to check those guys out, I highly recommend. And by helping them, you support the show as well. You can click on the icon here, the Squarespace logo, and go. You can actually start designing your website right away without a credit card, and then it's like $8 a month. And they got all sorts of other cool services. If you use the code London, you get 10% off, and let them know that you're feeling us. So I would appreciate that, and thanks to them. And as I finish this walk through all of these bankers and other normal people as well, I just want to give a shout out to the guys at Bulletproof. They make a fantastic coffee that I drink every single day. I mix it with my brain octane oil, which is MCT oil, and some grass-fed butter, and I mix it up as I did this morning, and it's a fantastic way to start your day. They're a great company when it comes to biohacking and just putting the right shizzle in your bizzle, if you know what I'm saying. And funny enough, I was on the Dave Asprey Bulletproof Radio podcast, which I highly recommend. It's one of the only podcasts I've done since Rogan, and it was pretty good, man. He really got me talking, and that's going to be out, I think, in the next couple weeks. So sign up to that on your podcast and listen to what Dave's got going on. They put out like 2 a week. Very impressive when it comes to the amount of content they're doing. So there you go. I'm going to wrap it up now as I leave you in this crazy place that I used to call home. God bless all these bankers. After the ayahuasca episode, I don't think they're going to let me back in, but that's okay. I'm going to get over it, and I'll keep doing these shows and throwing this crazy content out to you folks. So if you're feeling it, let me know. Brian at londonreal.tv. Hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, occasional Instagram, and yeah, share this YouTube video is the best thing you can do. And now I leave you with a very intense discussion about the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center with Mr. Todd E. Pierce.
Here we go. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Mr. Todd E. Pierce, who retired as a major in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Corp in November of 2012. You were on the defense team representing 3 clients held at Guantanamo Bay.
That's correct.
You are a founding member of the Institute for the Study of American Militarism and a senior fellow of the Human Rights Center at the University of Minnesota. You are currently working on a paper detailing the implications for free speech under the quote-unquote law of war. Todd, welcome to London Real.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. You know, I saw a piece that 60 Minutes did, I think 6 months ago or 9 months ago, where I believe Leslie Stahl took a trip down to Guantanamo Bay, and she walked around and saw the facilities and talked to the people that work there, and she heard some of the protests from some of the prisoners. And I was in New York City for 9/11. I lost some friends in that accident. I was very close to it when it happened, and it did make me quite angry. But, watching this show and seeing some of these people that had been denied a trial for, 11 years or whatever it's been, made me equally as angry and seemed to me to be one of the most un-American things that I could imagine, of someone not getting a trial. So it's just one of the reasons I really wanted to have you on today. And I was just wondering if you could walk us through what's been in your involvement with Guantanamo, and also maybe if you could later walk us through kind of the pre and post 9/11 mentality shift that happened with American policy, and what your thoughts are about it today.
So I volunteered to my military career has been Army Reserve, and where I was on active duty a number of years as an Army Reservist until recently, before I retired, and then it was shifted into regular Army anyway. But so I've been on and off active duty as an Army Reservist. I was on active duty then at 911 as a legal advisor in a major Army Reserve command. So I saw how that affected the military in a lot of ways, because you could almost see it during the day as it's like a change in consciousness of how people were looking at things. And unfortunately, I think that's continued up until the current day to many people. But anyway, I volunteered in 2007, 2008 to go and represent Guantanamo detainees as defense counsel. I wrote an article about that in 2010 where I pointed out that my father had been in the Bataan Death March. He'd been a prisoner of war until 1945. He was liberated and from this prisoner of war camp. And so sort of grew up, with that always in the back of my mind, maybe generating interest in the Nuremberg trials and the whole era of that era of militarism and authoritarianism in Germany, Italy, and Japan at that time. And so it's sort of been a lifelong, interest among many others. And so I volunteered, as I said, to represent Guantanamo detainees. So I went on to active duty then in 2008 and served until the end of 2012. I still represent a detainee. Currently, his case is before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, one level below the Supreme Court. But anyway, as I pointed out, it offended me so badly when people like Gonzalez, who was in the Bush administration, and others talked about Geneva Conventions being quaint, and we don't need to give those rights to and they're really not rights, they're treaty obligations we have to the people we're picking up. So, of course, I, like every American, was obviously struck a lot with 9/11. But as a military officer, I've a number of times taken an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States of America against its enemies. And, unlike other nations, as Americans in the military and government officials, we don't swear to defend the motherland or the fatherland or the Führer, the leader. We defend the Constitution. And that was under attack. If there's a House of Un-American Activities committee today, they should be investigating the Bush administration for everything they did to attack and subvert the Constitution in violation of their oaths. So that's really why I volunteered, because this is where those legal arguments were being made in the military commissions, which itself is a violation of the separation of powers under the Constitution, which the Supreme Court has said is a fundamental principle of our Constitution.
So they shouldn't be doing, you're saying the separation of military and the Constitution, they shouldn't be even conducting these trials?
That's correct. We have a judicial branch for trials such as this. There's been a couple of periods in our history, and there's a couple of very unique exceptions to that. And the government has misstated those, justifying the chief prosecutor, Brigadier General Mark Martins, has come to London speaking at Chatham House, and he's talked about this, rich part of our history of the military commissions. And in fact, they're not a rich part of our history. That may not have been the term he used, but they're not a part of our routine judicial history. In fact, they're an aberration. The cases where they're allowed is only when you have martial law in your domestic territory, or when you have military government, which is over occupied territory, or for the trial of actual war crimes, international war crimes, such as happened at Nuremberg. But again, Nuremberg too came upon the occupation of Germany by the Allied powers, giving them their authority. So what the government is now doing in our case, our appellate case, is they're arguing having conceded that material support for terrorism and conspiracy are not international war crimes, are not war crimes under international law, so they concede that point. But what they claim now is that it falls under our U.S. domestic common law of war, as if something like that ever existed before they invented it. What our domestic common, and for that they go back to the Civil War, when the United States, and I don't mean the Confederate States, they were treated as if they were a regular belligerent, an enemy state. But in the northern states, Lincoln, and I'm not second guessing him, and obviously we had a complete breakdown in our government, so don't take this as Lincoln bashing, but during the Civil War, a big problem was that there was a lot of divided loyalties. So they being the Union government, the Northern government, Lincoln, the United States government, had declared martial law in certain areas. And under that, military commanders had the authority to detain, make military arrests of anybody saying anything even disloyal, on up to guerrilla warfare. So there was military commissions held in places like Maryland immediately after the beginning of the Civil War. But in 1862, September of 1862, Lincoln declared martial law over the entire United States, meaning that part of the Union states, reaching as far as Eugene, Oregon, where a newspaper publisher had his newspaper shut down because he was a Quaker, and he said that we should find some way to end this war. So his newspaper was shut down, and he didn't get arrested by the military. But under martial law, it imposed an absolute duty of loyalty upon anybody under that Union territory. So even if you expressed dissent to waging the war or how it was being waged, saying words embarrassing to the government, you were in violation of martial law. And the terminology of the day was a war crime, meaning simply you were in violation of that one area of the law of war that permitted martial law. So the U.S. government today is mining those Civil War cases and extracting that sort of language, archaic language.
Do they quote them specifically on
They'll quote them specifically, except they will omit certain critical points. And I may be going into more detail than you want, but Colonel William Winthrop has been described by the U.S. Supreme Court as the Blackstone of American law. So he pointed out that under the law of war, there is what is known, and it still exists, but it's seldom applied except by the most totalitarian states, claiming that or authoritarian states claiming that they're at war with somebody, such as Pinochet's Chile. Pinochet declared he is at war with the communists, and so that allowed him to jail and execute all these extrajudicially all these supposed enemies, communists, which included journalists and others who were just critics of Pinochet. And that's the practice of authoritarian states. Well, we have now not falling totally into that, but we are borrowing those same legal principles. So the principle is that when a nation goes to war, its population immediately has, and its residents, anybody within their territory, has an immediate duty of loyalty, and it's called the law of non-intercourse. So one nation goes to war against another. Each enemy's population is the enemy of the other and can have no intercourse whatsoever with either of them. And that means any correspondence, any contact whatsoever puts you in violation of this law of non-intercourse, or anything which, again, imposes an absolute duty of loyalty. So if you're a guerrilla, the offense would be, might have been described in the military commissions as acting as a guerrilla or burning bridges, but also could include having correspondence with the enemy.
Okay. Let me come back to that.
Let me just make one.
Go ahead,
So one father in the North had sent a letter to his Confederate son. He was tried by military commission for corresponding with the enemy.
Okay.
So that's how extreme it can be.
Okay. Now, so you're comparing using those examples as similar as Pinochet, as similar as some of the things the Nazis were doing or the Stalin regime.
And so let me be clear. I'm not saying that we are doing the same things as the Stalin regime. And when you talk about, we're something similar to the Nazi regime, immediately people say, well, of course, we're not as bad as the Nazis. And they're absolutely right. The Holocaust is something entirely different. But a book I've come across is called The Dual State by Ernst Fraenkel. He was a relatively prominent German lawyer. and German Jewish lawyer. He left in 1939, and he got to the U.S. and he wrote a book, The Dual State. And the first line in it was, Germany is under martial law, something to that effect. And what he points out is that all of the legal system of Germany was operating routinely, except for that sliver, which, as I say, was under martial law. And that is finding those enemies and disloyalty, anybody disloyal. So if you said something such as one butcher said about Hitler that, we wouldn't be sure to meet if it wasn't for Hitler or something, he got picked up, put in front of the People's Court, which was a military commission, and tried and convicted and executed. Now, of course, we're not doing anything like that, but the principle. And, so what is valuable about looking at Germany, and I don't mean entirely at Nazi Germany, but how a democracy can evolve from a democracy in 1919 under the Weimar Republic with authoritarian elements within it constantly subverting that constitution and pushing for dictatorship. And that article I mentioned, Guantanamo at 10, I pointed out in there that we have prominent U.S. Law professors now from one Harvard, one University of Chicago, who have written quite extensively on the need for some form of dictatorship, unitary executive theory, as Cheney famously called it. And incredibly, these two law professors have even written, and I have it in my article, that we need to go back and look at Carl Schmitt and study Carl Schmitt's works. Carl Schmitt was the Nazi legal jurist. He wasn't a Nazi in the 1920s, but he's an authoritarian German lawyer, and he eventually joined the Nazi Party. And you can see just laid out how you evolve with authoritarian elements, adopting authoritarian forms of law
so you're seeing,
into who knows what.
Okay, so there's potential parallels here happening in America.
So the parallels are the legal theories underneath it.
Okay. Can you walk me through Guantanamo? Can you walk me through what's currently going on down there right now and where it's kind of come from the last, say, 12 years? So what is currently going on, and beginning, remember, and this has been covered by so many others, but initially they wanted to find a way, and you got to really look at Cheney and the gang of lawyers that he got around him, who had in most cases had been saying the same thing, we got to have unitary executive theory. 9/11 was their opportunity to say, see, we got to have a unitary executive, we're at war now, and they've adopted this, their own unique interpretation of the Constitution that to claim war powers when you're at war. So they needed a war to justify and implement their theory of unitary executive theory under the supposed war powers of the president, which in their interpretation means the president then can exercise extrajudicial dictatorial powers because acting as commander-in-chief. Okay.
So they invented this whole scheme of law, borrowing a little bit from international armed conflict, a little bit from non-international armed conflict, and now in the Civil War, weaving this all together and getting this idea that, well, we can have prison camps too. I mean, just like these other authoritarian states did, so can we.
But they had to intelligently place them.
So they had to figure out a way, though, to get it out from under the Constitution. And some of these people have been working full-time at it, I will say, ever since, to try to justify that, yeah, we're at war, so we need to put the Constitution aside. And I vigorously disagree with that.
Was this a plan for 10, 20, 30 years back that Guantanamo would be a place?
Dick Cheney has famously said, if you want to understand unitary executive theory, or however you put it, go back and read the Iran-Contra Minority Report, which he largely authored as the member of Congress at the time. And I'm actually reading a book which I highly recommend to anybody watching this and to you. It's The Family Jewels by John Prados, and it's a current book, a recent book. And the family jewels are the many secrets of the CIA going back to its founding, of every sort that has been tried to keep out of the public view. And these are those things that came out when William Colby revealed them to the Church Committee in the United States Congress in the 1970s, showing how there had been plans to assassinate people and a whole variety of things, total surveillance of the American people, etc. You got to remember, during the Vietnam War, the Army was conducting surveillance of anti-war activists and others that they believed were in dissent. And now the Army, meaning the Department of Defense, the NSA, which falls under the Department of Defense, is now, as we know, is surveilling everybody, and including people in the United States, all people in the United States, virtually, with the, picking up of all the data that they're doing.
Right. And Iran-Contra, you're saying, that's
So-
what, 86, 87?
So this was, Iran-Contra was in 86, 87, and so Cheney put it out then about, again, his unitary executive theory, and with 9/11 then, everything, if you read the legal opinions written by John Yoo, he always, or virtually always, and it wasn't John Yoo alone. Unfortunately, there's others. Robert Delahunty, who now teaches in Minnesota at a law school, was a co-author of many of these opinions, and there's a number of other attorneys in that office, legal counsel, all writing on the same theme, that the president, under his unitary executive powers, can do anything he wants. He can violate international treaties like Geneva, and on.
So Guantanamo was the perfect place to put
So
it.
Guantanamo was a perfect place.
Were there any other options besides Guantanamo, in your legal opinion?
And here's the other thing, and you mentioned 9/11. But Ali Soufan, who was an FBI agent who had been involved with investigating Mideastern terrorist incidents or acts of violence like that for a number of years before, he wrote in a book, The Black Banners, that the United States, the CIA, when they first went in the military then, when they first went into Afghanistan, they gave vehicles out to the Northern Alliance. And you got to remember the Northern Alliance weren't a bunch of Democrats waiting, to throw flowers at the U.S. when they came in. They were the old allies of the Soviet Union. But in any case, and ruthless and have their own torture practices. But anyway, so we came in, according to Ali Soufan, and gave them vehicles to help us, fight the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And in some cases, they would drive their vehicle into some village that had never seen a vehicle before, offer a ride to villagers. They'd get on, and then they'd deliver them over to some U.S. base post and collect a reward. So, the people that Donald Rumsfeld said were the worst of the worst terrorists, I think they initially numbered around 770 or whatever the exact number were people that had been picked up and sold for a bounty, according to Ali Soufan, of the FBI. That number has diminished. Actually, really only started beginning to diminish when the Bush administration released a whole bunch when they finally got some court scrutiny over what they were doing. Before that, they had, claimed that nobody could know anything because these were such dangerous terrorists.
Okay.
But
and they weren't bringing them to Guantanamo.
So initially they were putting almost all of them in Guantanamo.
When was the first person put in Guantanamo?
January of 2002.
Okay, so quite quickly afterwards. So.
And initially it went up to 700 and some. Now there were some captured in that same period or shortly after that they put into the black sites, so-called black sites, and they only appeared 4 or 5 years later, or whatever it was.
But Guantanamo was probably the best option because it was not on U.S. territory.
Well, the best option if you wanted to violate the law. If you wanted to violate international treaties and wanted to violate the Constitution, they came up with this scheme and they looked at, well, can we put them on ships that were just floating detention ships or whatever? And they decided Guantanamo because it seemed to fit their purpose. We had gotten that territory following the Spanish-American War. I won't go into all those details. But so it's been a sort of a lonely little Navy outpost for years, used only when there's immigrant issues, such as from Haiti or Cuba.
Have you been there?
I've been there at least somebody's asked me earlier how many times. I forget exactly, but went down about 15 times, 15 to 20.
What's it like down there?
Well, it's quite bleak. The golf course, remember it's a Navy base, so you've got a golf course.
Okay.
That's not on the
standard
detention camp side, but you carry a piece of carpet around to hit the ball off of. So it's like a desert island in a sense. It's on that side of the island that gets no rain virtually except during hurricane season. So you come in and it's a small Navy post ordinarily, except when you are having a trial. Then I remember somebody, maybe the first, Morris Davis was the first prosecutor in the military commissions, and he's totally repudiated them now and has spoken out against them quite frequently. It might have been him or somebody else pointed out the very first hearing that they had, which was before my time there, but it was as if they expected the D-Day invasion, expecting Al-Qaeda perhaps even to come up with a submarine. And it just shows how hysterical some of the people in the security services, whether the intelligence or the military services, how they've seen all this. And you got to keep in mind that they're almost trained to think very narrowly, because of their field, which is why you always have to have oversight, because again, they're self-censored. They don't think very broadly. So, I mean, this is how hysterical they were. They thought maybe even submarines might land. But anyway,
so it was a high security environment.
Well, especially when there's a trial going on.
Okay.
Otherwise, you land and it's a quiet little Navy base until you go out to the camps. And Carol Rosenberg has written extensively, and I'm not saying anything that's classified, but then you drive out to where the camps are, and then it's entirely different. Then you're in a very high security zone, a lot of prohibitions and whatnot, and you don't actually go in to see the detainees where they're kept, but rather you go and they're brought over from where they're kept into meeting areas where they're and again, this has been widely reported, shackled and it's a very onerous process even to bring them over. So it's almost as if they're trying to discourage detainees from meeting with their attorneys. They do the full body searches and very embarrassing, etc.
Does anyone belong there?
Well, no, actually nobody belongs there. Where they belong, those people who've committed actual crimes, not made up ones. And like I say, made up material support for terrorism and conspiracy, which even the D.C. Circuit Court is saying is not an international war crime. But no, they belong in a federal court system, and there's multiple ways that can be done. So those people who there's a suspicion or there's allegations who actually were responsible for killing Americans on 9/11, there's a legal process and legal procedure that we created, going back to our framing, that is readily available and is the means that is supposed to try people guilty or alleged to have committed criminal acts. Those people who were rounded up and bounties paid and whatnot, I think it's General Tommy Franks who said at the very beginning, should have been given Article 5 hearings under the Geneva Conventions. Article 5 hearings are where the government has to be able to show that there's at least some reason why we think they're with the opposing enemy or something's giving the government authority to hold them under international law as prisoners. And immediately, I actually talked to somebody just recently who said, who was detained at that time, and said for a day or two they were given the things that you'd fill out as a prisoner of war, and that was all taken back like a day or two later. The decision had come down, from what I read, is no, there'll be no Article 5 hearings. It was as if not as if, we know, the attorneys surrounding Cheney, because they were his, Cheney was really...
This is Cheney's brainchild, this whole operation.
Right. The attorneys around him, the ones that he'd brought in precisely for this purpose. I mean, he didn't know 9/11 was going to happen. But John, you had been writing on these same themes for years as a law professor, talking about unitary executive theory. So he'd already brought him in. I mean, it was his job qualification, I guess, as, you believe in dictatorship? Yeah, we can use you.
Okay. How many detainees are at Guantanamo
So I think
now?
the number now is 164 or 166, and don't hold me to that. They released some people over the past few months.
And are some of those people on trial now?
So now there's currently 5 people on trial for allegedly being responsible for the 9/11 attack, and they're described as high-value detainees, high-value prisoners. And then there's another one, Nashiri, who's on trial for the attack on the USS Cole in 2000.
Okay.
Those are the 2 main trials going on. And just in the past week or so, another detainee has been charged and has already pleaded guilty. I haven't had good internet access, but I believe he's already entered a plea of guilty to conspiracy for allegedly having a role in that same attack on a different ship in 2002, I believe. The USS, or not the USS, it's a French ship, the Limburg. I haven't been following it.
And the other 150 some odd are awaiting trial?
So about 76, 77 have already been cleared for release, but mainly Yemeni background, or I don't know, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, and they're ready to be released, and then we said because of the unrest in Yemen, or supposed unrest, that no, we can't let them go back now. So they're sitting there just cooling their heels, as might have been said in the U.S., waiting to be released. They've been cleared. And then there's a number of others, and I don't have the exact numbers, who are claimed to be too dangerous to release, but there's no evidence against them. So that would suggest, that they're the ones, at least a larger number of them are the ones who've been tortured, and they haven't been able to get clean testimony from them or clean confessions. So
they don't have specific charges, or they don't have a
so
trial.
they're all just sitting there without charge, and if you don't have charges, you don't get an attorney assigned to you ordinarily. There's a couple, and I have a friend who was assigned to somebody who briefly had charges against him, and then those charges were withdrawn. So he had an attorney representing him, and she actually, has described, he's one of those who are just being held there, and his mental condition is, of course, deteriorating. The Physicians for Human Rights group in the U.S. has produced a report that indefinite detention itself can rise to the level of torture.
Right.
And that's only logical. And so I think we're seeing a lot of mental deterioration amongst a large number of the people, and even some suicides as a result.
It's almost as if they would rather be charged, because then you can have an attorney.
At least then you get an attorney and have a chance to confront the charges. And and quite honestly, the only way you get out of there, and these 6 high-value detainees, that's another issue, but the only other way, for the most part, you get out is if you plead guilty to some very minimal, claimed offense, such as one of my clients who basically admitted to cooking for Al-Qaeda. Excuse me, I've got a cold. And maybe being a gopher. And so he pleaded guilty to material support for terrorism, and he's now back in his home country of Sudan.
Now, Obama famously ran on the platform that he was going to shut it down, and then a few years after he was elected, he pretty much said he couldn't shut it down. Is that correct? Well, what did he try to do, and was he ever going to be able to do that?
Well, I don't know if he was ever able to, and I can only speculate on. I think his intent was sincere in running and in declaring that, and a lot of people were very happy. It sounded like this national nightmare might come to an end. I mean, by national nightmare, it's spilling over into our own domestic system in a variety of ways, which I'll explain in a few minutes. But so they had a year, and one of the things attorneys did was presented cases that went for a review on why their client should not be charged with an offense and should be released. And of course, we pointed out in the person who went to go back to Sudan that you got to keep in mind, remember, we recruited, and by we, the CIA recruited a lot of Arabs to go fight in Afghanistan back in the 1980s when we were trying to bankrupt the Soviet Union. And the client had been on a team representing from Sudan. In fact, had been one of those. Whether or not it was a personal solicitation or just heard, but anyway, go to Sudan, fight the Soviets. So he had gotten there way back in the 1980s, and so anyway, we'd pointed out that he's not Al Qaeda, in the sense of planning terrorist attacks. There's a whole very loose association in Afghanistan, because obviously there's still internal, or there was back in 2001, struggles, fights, between a variety of people without any clear allegiances to necessarily one particular group. So the people under bin Laden was made up of one faction. Northern Alliance was made up of a number of different factions. The Taliban, too, was made up of a number of different factions. And varying, and shifting alliances were all fighting. And we basically went in and said, well, if you're not Northern Alliance, you're all terrorists, and we're going to throw you all in, in Guantanamo. So we pointed out that, this guy, our client was not a Al-Qaeda terrorist, and nobody got released following those reviews, is my recollection, and our client didn't. And we did go to, and in fact, I made a motion, and it was granted that he was he had a Article 5 hearing coming. And there's only been one or two of those. Well, one would have been this one, and another one was Hamdan, where they too argued to have an Article 5 hearing. And so that, the court ordered an Article 5 hearing to be held 30 days out from the hearing in 2010. And when that was ordered, it was as if the government just changed its entire theory. Before, he was the worst of the worst, and afterward, after they were ordered that they'd have to provide some evidence that he is what they said he was, it seemed like they were willing to talk. And
what's the spirit of your clients when you go down and talk to them?
Well, it's obviously very depressed. How can it not be? But it's resignation in a lot of ways.
Are they suspicious of you?
Yeah. I mean, and back in the earlier days, maybe not now. Certainly, still some obviously, I would presume some distrust. But
there was some surveillance going on in the cells and in the meeting rooms.
I mean, I just assume that, being the skeptic or cynic that I am, and so did most people. But they found evidence of it. Found an old camera, and but this, got to keep in mind, the government had always been denying, lying that was taking place, and it turned out they found evidence that it was.
Right, which is against attorney-client privilege and all that.
So they like to present, they're getting all these due process rights, and this is full and fair courts and whatnot. Brigadier General Mark Martins, he's really the seller of that idea, and no, that's false.
What about what was your reception like in the military when you took that role on to defend these guys?
Well, I've got a couple, friends I'd worked with on active duty before then, and one is very, hardcore right wing, I'll say, and so he didn't believe they should even get military commissions. I think in his less guarded moments, he might have even said, "Go out and shoot him."
What do you say to those people that say, "Go out and shoot him"?
Well,
I think one of your clients, you're saying that the worst thing he did was make videos for Al Qaeda and was otherwise not involved in any specific planning. What do you say to those people in the military?
No, I mean, again, how much more un-American can you get? I mean, again, they took an oath, and they just. I mean, I hate to make comparisons to these authoritarian states, but it's that mindset, that militaristic mindset or authoritarian-minded thinking that, basically that, well, they're not on, this book I mentioned, The Dual State, and a couple of other books on that same thing. Same thing that, they point out in these trials that Germany held in the People's Court, which were about, not having total, absolute loyalty to the Führer. It's the same principle, as I say, this law of non-intercourse. So it just was ominous almost when Bush said, "If you're not with us, you're against us." That is the way of thinking of authoritarianism, where anybody of any sort of dissenting opinion is acting disloyally. And that was never brought in during the entire Vietnam War. We had hundreds of thousands of people gathering outside the Pentagon protesting the Vietnam War. And I would say they succeeded in bringing a war that was unwinnable to an end, which is actually against the United States interests for a variety of reasons. But coming out of it, people like General Westmoreland, who had been responsible for not knowing what he was doing, was a thorough incompetent, as been documented in some recent books lately. But he had this conceit because he had the command. I mean, again, there's sort of a conceit that goes with too many military commanders that, well, they gave me command, so therefore I'm the infallible, person at the top of the heap that knows everything. And
which is why you want a judicial system in the first place.
Exactly. So some of these people came out, call them the dead enders, or this, people. They came up with their own stab in the back myth, just like Ludendorff did after World War I. And led to this whole idea, is that they would have won the war but for the press. And the press, led to this loss of will to fight, and therefore that's why we lost the Vietnam War. Well, too much of that has been internalized in military thinking, and I won't go through. I've written some on this and writing more. But this was internalized to where we have this very information management system in place now, and we saw that with embedded journalists. We don't allow journalists to go around and actually gather facts anymore, but we put them in a group and have them bond, etc. So you don't get this really wide-ranging investigation into things.
Do you have something specific you say to your friends when they're said they don't deserve a trial, we should shoot them anyways? Well, I mean, do you just say that's not what this country was built on, or?
Oh, you make that argument, and here's the argument I make too: is again, you put a person like a Westmoreland, who's his accomplishment before that, his major accomplishment was getting funding for the football stadium at West Point. One day he's doing that, the next day he's in Vietnam running a war. He didn't know anything about running a war. And yet we had him in place, having American lives being lost and killed. And so, with hindsight, you could say that the Vietnam War protesters actually knew more about the actual facts of what was taking place than Westmoreland did. That's why you need oversight. And that's why, when we turn everything over to the security services, and Britain would have the same problem, we're deferring to people who have deliberately closed their mind because of their past training or their predisposition to looking at the larger picture. Okay. And that was the genius, I would say, of the American Constitution. We ensured, and that was one of our grievances in the Declaration of Independence, that King George had placed the military authorities over the civil authorities. In other words, we had martial law under the English troops in places like Boston. So that was a grievance. So we demanded the civil authorities being over the military authorities, and that's what our Constitution was built upon. And that's what the Bill of Rights was put into it. The Bill of Rights is not a bunch of luxuries given to Americans because we're American citizens. It was put in, and it was almost as, it wasn't as an afterthought. There's a lot of demands for it by people who realize that, wait a minute, we don't want to reproduce what a king, basically government officials without any oversight. The Bill of Rights was put there as a means of oversight of our government officials. You can go back and read Madison and others. But critical to it was the First Amendment, which, you put it all together, it's really the right to know. How can you have a democracy and make wise decisions by the people who are supposed to be making the decisions, the electorate, if you don't have the right to know, if they don't have access to the information they need? And that's what is so dangerous today. There's a lawsuit going on right now. I'm not sure the status of it. It was decided against a journalist, but Hedges v. Obama, where we have Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012 now put into public law, providing that the president, as commander-in-chief, has authority to deem people who are just a wide, ambiguous list of associated with terrorism some way, to be put into military detention pending disposition under the law of war. That signifies, I think that declares that if there ever is a military detention of a U.S. citizens under that provision, the law of war that they would then turn to would be these martial law cases that we now call our U.S. domestic common law of war, that they would make that same argument and say, here's our domestic common law of war, and so we're going to apply that. So under those precedents, all of a sudden a Chris Hedges, a journalist, they might analogize and say, yeah, here's this Edmund Ellis, whom the government actually cited his case, who was a newspaper publisher in Missouri who was put into military detention and tried by military commission. They've actually cited that as a case in some of the filings that they've done.
Okay.
So it's laid the predicate for that type of prosecution.
Let me just a few just other off the wall questions. President Obama orders the execution of Osama bin Laden. And I believe they also ordered the execution of the American citizen that was the al-Qaeda representative in Yemen, I believe it was. He has the right to do that, but now he can't have the right to detain someone indefinitely in Guantanamo.
Well, why would you say he has a right to do that?
That's what I'm asking you.
Yeah. And I don't know whether or not he ordered Osama bin Laden to be killed or executed, okay. But certainly, indisputably, he did for Al-Awlaki. And they claim that Al-Awlaki's an operational leader. Well, what does that mean? In the military, you have a whole lot of people doing lots of different things who have combatant status, but they don't carry, they may even carry a gun somewhere. They long since forgot how to use it. You have psychological operations, which is, propaganda. And so what does it mean to be an operational leader? Is that somebody just, in the Civil War, I hate to keep going back to it, but those are the precedents that we're now using in the military commissions. Edmund Ellis, the newspaper publisher, would have been said, and there's, and you can go back, there's lots of stuff available, and I cite to it in some articles I've written. William Whiting was a Solicitor General of the War Department. He talks about how judges and journalists and people saying things that are critical of the government, they're even more dangerous than the actual combatants of the people wearing uniforms, because they saw them as insidiously subverting that will of the people to fight.
So it gets dangerous here when we start saying...
It's extremely dangerous. And again, this is what I mean. These are the same legal principles that authoritarian states always use to suppress their own dissent. We see this right now in Egypt with the prosecution of the Al Jazeera journalists. So the government has conceded in the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit, and they won. Or rather, the court held that Hedges and these other journalists, including some German and a journalist and a Icelandic parliamentarian, they said they all had no standing. But the government conceded in one of their statements that okay, under these particular facts, what they've said, we don't have authority for military detention. But depending on what else they might say, yes, there is. And in fact, and they said too, as far as the German and the person from Iceland, the parliamentarian, I think she may have been involved with protests there about, I don't know, maybe WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning, I don't know. but said, yes, they are subject to military detention. So this is what, nobody should delude themselves. What we're saying with the Military Commissions Act and calling, we may have won on the material support for terrorism, but they still have conspiracy. This is dangerously authoritarian. And we're already, one person has written, a commentator, frequent commentator, in somebody who's supportive of all the military commissions, has written that this appears a lot like martial law being exercised globally. And in fact, it is. When we take martial law precedents from the Civil War and say that those same cases apply to somebody that we picked up in, say, Bosnia, like the case of Boumediene, that's in essence, or in fact, exercising martial law over the world.
Okay, and the assassination of these targets is exercising even further. Because you could argue that as opposed to taking these people down to Guantanamo and giving them some type of trial, which is fair or not, that they could be executed in the field and we wouldn't even know about it under what currently the administration deems as appropriate.
And that's what's so dangerous, because it seems, reasonable, okay. But are they civilians, or are they actual combatants? They invented, again, John Yoo invented this term, enemy unlawful combatant, unlawful enemy combatant, and they took that out of a case. I won't go into the legal analysis of it, but Kieran. But it was taken entirely out of context. But again, it falls under this law of non-intercourse, which imposes an absolute duty of loyalty. So when those 8 German saboteurs came ashore and took their uniform off, so they weren't distinguishing themselves as part of the enemy, even though they were the enemy soldiers, they still incurred this absolute duty of loyalty as now being resident on our territory under this law of non-intercourse. So that's what put them into violation of the law of war.
This is from World War II?
This is from World War II.
Okay.
So in writing the opinion, one of the justices wrote they're unlawful enemy combatants, meaning they're enemy combatants, they're German soldiers, but they're, because they took their uniform off and were within our territory, therefore, for that reason alone, were unlawful. And therefore, we had authority to, have a military commission.
And then the Geneva Convention doesn't apply.
And the Geneva Convention, this was before the final version of them, the current version, but it provided as long as you have a trial. And so in the same time, but what the government has argued is that just by their very nature, somebody who is somewhere picked up in the world without a uniform on is inherently a unlawful enemy combatant if they're deemed to be so.
Okay, so it's extremely subjective.
So it's subjective the way the government has been using it. What we're talking about with somebody in the most cases are civilians. And in under the Geneva Convention's current one, 4th Geneva Convention, it does give authority for a belligerent to protect itself from saboteurs, spies, and people who might be within their own territory who are dangerous. And it uses a term who commits a hostile act. But it applies only to military government, which means where the military is exercising authority over occupied territory, or under martial law.
Okay.
Doesn't apply globally. Nothing provides it. So when you pick up somebody like Boumediene from Bosnia, he was a civilian in a foreign territory that was not under military occupation by the U.S., nor was it under martial law. So he falls under the protections given to civilians under various human rights treaties.
Okay.
And we treated him as an enemy combatant. That was a war crime itself, the way we treated a civilian. And the same thing applies to deeming somebody a civilian an enemy combatant and then killing him.
Okay, I understand your point there. Todd, where do we go from here? I mean, how can we change any of this? I mean, how can we change the next administration believing that they have these rights, to target these individuals, to continue a lot of this behavior?
Well, I think a big first step is just realizing how dangerous it is. I'm not for a moment saying that President Obama would use these legal arguments to the most extreme case, although I did write an article on how it might be, without more transparency, how the drone warfare is almost resembling the Phoenix program out of Vietnam, where we were killing civilians, where civilians were deliberately being killed because the theory was, under counterinsurgency, was that they were the infrastructure providing support to the actual Viet Cong. So we weren't killing the Viet Cong, or they would have been surplusage, but we were killing the civilians that sort of, we allege who were supporting them. And that means family groups, other villagers, etc. And that was put into the church committee and deplored and condemned. So we're, it has to be asked. And I actually have seen a couple of military officers who've written, at least one of who on my site, say, yeah, maybe this is back in 2005. Maybe we need to adopt something like the Phoenix program again. And I spoke with somebody the other day and was sort of saying, how many these civilians, that are being killed, are questionable, that they might have just been exercising some sort of dissent from what we're doing. And
all right, so it's dangerous territory here.
so I'll leave it it's very dangerous.
So you want to educate people so they'll be aware of these things are happening and that they're just fundamentally unconstitutional.
Exactly. Fundamentally unconstitutional and inviolative of international treaties, Geneva Conventions and human rights law.
Okay. Now, from here, where does Edward Snowden fit into this whole picture? Because I know in your Institute for the Study of American Militarism, and you talk a lot about the First Amendment and how that is an important thing to talk about when it comes to all the trickle-down consequences and how that affects how our
And let me be
military
clear, the
behaves.
Institute for the Study of American Militarism is something that's been incorporated. We'll see where this goes. So it's really nothing organized at this point other than having a corporate name. But there are a number of people who have already said they'd be associated with people who, we who are very credible and have a lot of respect in the community of national security. And there's a book I mentioned already, The Family Jewels, and it talks about surveillance. And I could go on about what surveillance ultimately means. It really is about tracking dissenters. So my understanding is Bradley Manning, Edward Snowden, they both tried going through the chains of command, to bring this to the attention and get some notice that, wait a minute, we're violating the law here. And in both those cases, they were dismissed, we don't want to talk about this. So they ended up going and resorting to the means that they did. But it is fundamental, as I say, for a democracy to have the right to know. And this has been so closely controlled, and the Bradley Manning has shown the consequences of what happens if you reveal it. And there's other whistleblowers who have too, all of whom pay a huge price in various ways, which I believe has the additional intent of being made an example of, so that nobody else dares to reveal anything. But this book on the family jewels, it's all about this. Generally, what is done, and even what the United States now has in the courts of state secrets privileges, if you look at it factually, historically, it's more often to cover up criminality, dereliction of duty, or just plain negligence, which is what the original court case that was decided proved. When they finally did a FOIA Act request, Freedom of Information Act request, 30, 40 years later, and got some information, turned out what the United States was protecting as a state secret was merely negligence by the aircrew that causes the plane that was the subject of the lawsuit to crash.
Was this, what was this, Vietnam?
No, this was shortly in the early 50s, I believe. I forget the exact name of the case now. It's been a long time since I even thought of it. But so some family members of the people who were killed brought a lawsuit, and the government protected itself, defended itself by claiming state secrets. And it turned out the only state secret was negligence by the aircrew. And that's how it's been so often used, or more particularly, as the Family Jewel shows, and William Colby, the director of the CIA, admitted, was to cover up criminality. And it's not about protecting us. It's not about what we have now is this huge amount of information. And again, using this Hedges-Obama lawsuit, and just speaking hypothetically, that let's say Hedges gets, the journalist who's this, named in who's bringing the lawsuit, reveals something more than what the security services want written, criticizing them, not revealing any classified information. And so they go back, and so easy now when you have all this information, you've captured all of his emails, all of his websites he's visited, and you can contrive a legal case, by weaving these things together, daisy chaining it in together to make something that, creating something that's legal, turning it into what appears to be illegal. Okay. This is extremely dangerous. Stasi agents have admitted this is how you do it.
Right, because most people have a hard time identifying your fundamental right to privacy to this American military state. What do you call it? The
Unitary executive theory is the term that's used.
Those are that's a big divide for most people to cross. You being able to read my Gmail to being able to have some militaristic state. But that's the argument you're making.
Yeah, and again, going back to Vietnam, this this argument coming out, the stab in the back myth that some of these generals adopted and perpetuated. We now have prominent commentators, arguing that we need to have censorship. We're in war. We're in a multi-generational war, or the long war, or various terms they use, salivating on the fact that we can keep scaring the American people into giving up any liberties they have under the Constitution. So they actually argue for, we need censorship. We need military detention for people who might be critical of the government. And they actually say saying things that might, cause our military's will, to lose their will to fight. This is authoritarian, pure authoritarianism. And again, I hate to even use the word liberties or rights because it suggests that these are luxuries we have in peacetime. No, these are how we keep track of a whole lot of incompetence in government. And incompetence, or those who will use the government, the power that they achieve for their own purposes. I mean, William Westmoreland had his own presidential ambitions. He was deliberately, and this is where a group of former intelligence officials came up, Sam Adams Associates for Integrity Intelligence, which I'm involved with. Sam Adams was a CIA analyst who went up the chain of command in the CIA, pointing out that Westmoreland was manipulating and lying about intelligence to make it look like he is winning.
He's during the Vietnam War, right?
In Vietnam.
Yeah.
And this was done to the detriment of American soldiers. I'm not unsympathetic to the additional Vietnamese who were killed in the war, but this is pure. The traitors in this thing was people like Westmoreland, because they were creating the conditions that more Americans would die.
Okay.
And this is what we need to realize: is you put somebody in charge and with no oversight, and people die. And they may well be our own soldiers.
Right.
So speaking as a retired soldier, I'm outraged.
And you're not against the military per se. You think this can help the military?
I'm for the military being used for those purposes of defending the nation, and not for intervening in where we become overly aggressive and waging what somebody else does, we might call crimes of aggressive war, but for national security, genuine national security, and not contrived, wars to just keep the idea going that we're in this perpetual state of war. Yes, I'm.
Okay. Todd, what makes you optimistic these days?
Well, I can still be on here talking to you. I guess that's cause for a little bit of optimism.
Is the fact that Snowden was successful in a lot of these revelations make you optimistic?
Well, it's optimistic that people saw how far this is going, but it's not. Makes me pessimistic to hear so many people who want to defer to these national. I don't even like to call them national security. Officials or whatever, because I think it's national insecurity. A former CIA analyst actually wrote a book, National Insecurity, showing how these practices are making us much less secure. Chalmers Johnson wrote a book called Blowback, and then he wrote a couple, before 9/11, pointing out that this putting military bases everywhere around the world, and we have combatant commands. U.S. has combatant commands covering every inch of the globe, maybe with the exception of Antarctica. And I don't say that facetiously, I mean everywhere else, exercising some kind of military authority everywhere we go. And I would recommend you read the book Dirty Wars on how this is even getting, how this has escalated over the last 12 years. And again, the book Blowback is about how this generates hostility toward us. And to those people, military authorities who think tactically, they see that as a threat to our national security. But it used to be before Cheney, before 9/11, before Cheney got to rewrite everything in the Department of Defense, we understood that grand strategy or those larger interests. And that's why the genius of our Constitution by separation of powers and placing the civil authorities above the military and requiring them to act as civil authorities and not acting as if they're part of the military, like this commander-in-chief theory does, gave us the greater wisdom of realizing that the true national security of a nation includes its economic well-being, being able to educate its population, and that's what really makes for a nation's greatest strength, and then to, of course, use it responsibly, versus these tactical thinking that, let's go into this other nation, beat them up, kick-ass, as some people like to say. Neocon commentators used to always talk about kicking some other nation's ass, as they put it, and thinking that's what made us strong.
So that ultimately hurts us, having all those power presences.
That hurts us. And here you can see it no better terms. And we just cut in the proposed budget, and I don't have the exact numbers. I feel close. I think it's $22 billion for food stamps or something like that in the U.S. budget, and at the same time there's a corresponding increase for more military spending of like $24 or $26 billion. So we're at that stage now, because of the economic realities, that now we're having to steal from the domestic economy to continue giving it over to what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, to keep these, perpetual state of war going, so that we can then justify even more authoritarianism at home. It's a vicious circle that does not end well,
so
ordinarily.
You're happy that Snowden made these revelations, but your fellow Americans aren't taking their lack of privacy very seriously, is what you're saying.
And again, I hate to even use the term lack of privacy. Again, it's what's necessary for us to keep oversight over these people without fear. I mean, again, losing privacy means that we have to be more fearful of, and writers have said, myself, what I'm saying now, to some authoritarian like my former friend, still friends, the guy who's to take him out and shoot him, he'd probably see this as some form of disloyalty. I mean, again, because of that authoritarian mind. But the other population that has to be concerned is the global population. Why are they giving up global democracy, giving it over? You got to realize how draconian, totalitarian Dick Cheney really thinks. He and Paul Wolfowitz wrote way back in 1991 what was called the Draft Planning Guidance, asserting, secret, asserting that the United States now exercise global military domination over the world, and we would not tolerate anyone, even our allies, to have the means to question our policies. That was leaked by somebody from within the Pentagon, and of course even our allies most vigorously objected. We were telling Britain that we're not going to tolerate anything that might contrast our policies. And so they pulled it back, rewrote it a little bit, not meaningfully, and it was out there yet. Dick Cheney, when he came back into power as vice president, wrote following, and again, there's ample evidence out there that they were planning the war on Iraq even before 9/11. General Wesley Clark pointed that out, that they had a plan to take down 7 different Arab countries, following Richard Pearl's recommendation of fragmenting the Mideast. But in the end of 2001, Dick Cheney wrote the introduction to the Quadrennial Defense Review, and amongst the threats he identified to the United States were what he called anti-access threats. And what he meant exactly, does that mean any nation that would not allow Halliburton to come in and exploit the oil resources of that nation to the detriment of the people of that nation? Was that an anti-access threat, or would not allow a pipeline going through? And quite honestly, I suspect that that's really what he meant.
Okay.
Anybody that did not submit to what he had called, created this idea of global military domination from his 1991 paper, was written of as an anti-access threat.
Okay. Is this, are things going to get better or worse from here?
Well, when people realize what this really means to global governance as well as U.S. governance, that do we really want to turn the world into a, authoritarian state under, the U.S. military, domination, and that's not an exaggeration in any way. There's a book out I recommend if you want to see the thinking of this, is the Pentagon's New Map, which I've come across a couple different places, and it was on the recommended reading list of a number of the officers in the U.S. military, and was very influential, and within the Pentagon at least a few years ago, and I actually read it as part of my professional military reading, and it asserted that outside of a few core countries, which Great Britain might be happy to know that they were included in, the rest of the world was seen as basically hostile or savage or something like that, and the United States military had a duty to police those areas, and that covered the entire globe. And that's how expansive this authority is being asserted by some neoconservative or conservative, advocates of this sort of point of view.
Does the president have any control over this, or not really?
It makes you wonder. That's again, I have no inside knowledge, so. But President Obama came in saying certain things. He's going to shut down Guantanamo, and now we still have Guantanamo. And in fact, it's almost like we've escalated into it, took another step into this line of authoritarian thinking, where we've now got the case of U.S. citizens. And I was at the hearing, the Alaki hearing, the case brought, the action brought by Alaki's father to try to get an injunction against killing Alaki. And again, I've seen no evidence that Alaki ever did anything violent. He was certainly an advocate of against U.S. policies, but I'm not sure if he ever actually advocated, violence. But in any case, so I was at that hearing, and the government, the Department of Justice, unashamedly argued that, of course, the president has authority to kill U.S. citizens. So again, it's very dangerous, and obviously candidate Obama would not have made that claim, but President Obama's Department of Justice does make that claim.
Right. What's things that people listening or watching us can do? How can they learn more about this, and what are the few changes they can make? I mean, is it about really trying to go out there and protect your privacy, or to know about what the government's actually doing?
I just got an email on one of the lists I'm on today by a person who I consider very knowledgeable, and he's very knowledgeable about European politics. And he said, okay, so we've stood down, I guess an order has been issued, according to this, that, okay, we won't surveil, eavesdrop on Merkel, but we've increased the even closer surveillance, eavesdropping on all other or high-level German government officials. Again, and we've admitted, economic interests are one of our national interests. So why would other people in other nations want to give to the U.S. security services the right to eavesdrop on discussions taking place on how they'll negotiate contracts, a whole line of things that are all to the economic detriment of other nations by giving that information to the U.S. government for us to exploit for our own economic advantage. This is not about terrorism. This is about, vacuuming up all this information to be used for, again, economic negotiations, a whole lot, all under the pretext that these are a part of our national interests and therefore part of our national security interests. So again, people, I don't know exactly the answer, but if I was in a foreign nation, I would be demanding of my officials that they not go along with this sort of thing, recognizing that it might affect the economic well-being of a country such as Greece or Iceland, where we've already done a lot of harm with our own banking systems, selling the derivatives and whatever that all goes. So, so a lot of our economic policies are not to the benefit of people in other nations, and why are we given that authority as the United States security services to harm other nations' economic interests by having access to all this information? Again, I don't know, have the answer. Maybe you do.
That's a good place to start. That's a good place, especially in Europe here.
But one big start would be, and here's this Institute for the Study of American Militarism, our argument is the Constitution is our greatest strength. It was framed that way, developed that way, and that has actually been vindicated over a couple hundred years when all these authoritarian regimes like the Nazis, the Soviets, Mubarak and others, Mubarak, jury's still out on what's going to happen there, have all come and gone. And again, I'm not excusing lots of different things in the past, but but at one time we were, I'd say pre-9/11, no nation is perfect, but we were sort of a beacon of liberties, and I don't think anybody considers that anymore, at least on the polls I see.
Some people say the Constitution's out of date. It's old.
No, I vigorously disagree, and we probably don't have time for the many reasons, but I think I've already covered that. I don't want to give military policy development authority to General Westmoreland and 2 or 3 of his cronies, or his current General, Petraeus just a couple years ago. We've been sold this bill of goods that the Iraqi surge was a result of military genius on the part of General Petraeus, and I mentioned to somebody earlier today, this one journalist, Thomas Ricks, was very critical of how the Iraq war was conducted at the beginning, very critical of the generals, etc., and he's absolutely right. But he was seduced, I'll say, in my opinion, by Petraeus, and we know, and anyway, and he wrote a second book. I forget the title of it. The Generals, maybe. But anyway, there he was very, he couldn't have been more enthusiastic of Petraeus as supposed genius. And so I was at the book signing for this book, and I pointed out at the end of his going on about Petraeus' genius that no, it seemed to me we actually lost the war because we did not attain a military objective that requires the reconciliation of different groups within Iraq. We now had we only exchanged one group in power over the other. Nothing else had really changed. And I'm not exaggerating. He immediately conceded the point, and he said, yes, you're right, we lost. The surge failed. And he said exactly that. We didn't get that reconciliation between the Shiites and the Sunnis. So much for, Petraeus' genius.
Right.
But I won't speculate why this journalist would go on but there are witnesses to this too. So no, I don't want to defer. Now we've got another issue came up earlier today. Somebody talking about how many people stay in Afghanistan. I think the one thing that did succeed in Iraq, and the one thing that might succeed in Afghanistan, was when we told the people the insurgents that we're not against U.S. occupation, that we're not going to stay here forever, and gave them a date certain. And immediately, in the case of Iraq, most people no longer had a reason to fight the U.S. because they knew we were leaving. The uncertainty of whether or not the U.S. will stay is part of the motivation for continuing an insurgency against the U.S. staying in a nation.
Okay. No, point well made there. Todd, I ask everyone on the show a simple question at the end, and I'm going to ask you as well. If you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old Todd Pierce and give that young man a bit of advice, what would you tell him?
I sort of had a very non-traditional path into the law. I didn't go to law school till my 40s, and there's times I wish I'd taken a more direct path or whatever. Had a greater appreciation for education when I was young, and I did pass that on to my own son, a greater appreciation for education. But the caveat would be, don't just rely upon the information you're fed. You got to rely upon a wide variety of sources of information. Don't be afraid to look at different ideologies and try to understand what is motivating the thinking behind those ideologies. So I guess, yes, get educated at an earlier age than I did, but also don't constrict yourself, restrict yourself to only some sources of information. You think outside of the education you're being given. Actively seek more information. And depending upon the issue, realize you got to look at every side of that issue. Michael Scheuer, who's a CIA analyst, has written a book, Through Our Enemy's Eyes, about how the people now, associated with Al-Qaeda think. And that's absolutely essential to understand in whatever field you're in, is to understand the underlying thinking of others and to appreciate it even when you think that they're just the enemy, we can't have anything to do with them. You got to understand how people think.
That's well said. What's the best advice you've ever received?
I've gotten lots of good advice. So, I'd have to think about that.
Anything in the military that stands out?
I'm not sure. I've gotten a lot of good advice, and in different stages of my life, So, nothing immediately comes to mind. But I will say, I will say, I have a great co-counsel, lead attorney on one of the cases. I don't want to embarrass him by naming his name, but he's really the one who sort of directed me into looking more into the right to know. And so again, my lead attorney in one of the cases. And that's caused me to dig deeper and deeper and really try to sort out where these arguments are coming from and the costs that we've already incurred and the even greater potential costs if we give up this right to know. So having thought about it, I could come up with lots of people who've given me good advice, but nothing immediate.
No, it's important that you came on here and told us about kind of that right to know and how we really need to educate ourselves and become aware of what's going on, or the state can get a little bit out of control. So if people want to find out more about your institute, more about you, I know you're not on Twitter. How do people get a hold of you? How can they contact you?
So, like I say, the institute is not up and going yet. It's under development. So I guess I'll just, do I give out my email address?
Yeah, people may email you.
Let me just give out my email address, tep1983@msn.com.
Okay, fantastic. And you're heading back to the D.C. area sometime this year, next year?
Yeah, I'm going to move back. Minnesota, where I'm currently at, is just too cold, but
Too much snow.
and it's also too far away from people that share my concerns and and to work on these issues.
Todd, thanks so much for coming on today and telling us a little bit about Guantanamo and how that relates to so many other things. I mean, I had never even thought that the Civil War might have history that carried over, or even mentalities that carried over into our policies, 150 years later. But it's now obvious that there is. So thanks so much for kind of enlightening us on these issues. And no, it's been very educational for me. It's interesting because I think, Guantanamo's had its time where it's talked about, and this is probably one of the times where it's not talked about as much, but it's still a glaring, eyesore on American policy. So I'm glad we can talk about it.
Well, if I can just add one final thing, because it's no longer being talked about much, it makes it even more dangerous. Because again, the underlying legal principles, as I've said, are what are really dangerous here, and not just to Americans, but to everybody on this globe.
Okay. Todd, thanks so much. As we say on London Real, it's about the journey. I wish you well on yours, and all the best.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
All right, take care.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.
This week on London Real, we have Edward Snowden's attorney, Jessalyn Raddick.
Edward Snowden made the only choice he could make, which was to go outside of the United States to blow the whistle. What we're going through now, people should be marching in the streets over what NSA is doing. There has been so much fear-mongering by the government that they've been able to create an entire surveillance state.
And former NSA executive turned whistleblower Thomas Drake.
What I was blowing the whistle on was government illegality, violations of the Constitution, massive fraud, waste, and abuse and wrongdoing. This was raw power. This was the government saying, you know what? 9/11 is our excuse. We're just going to get the data. I was facing 30, 35 years plus in prison.
To send a chilling message.
To whom?
To other whistleblowers, to others in the government.
If you dare hold up a mirror to the government, if you dare speak truth to power or of power, we're going to hammer you and hammer you good.
On Sunday, London Real presents Jessalyn Raddick and Thomas Drake, NSA whistleblower.
We just don't do this to Americans. That's why we had an American Revolution.